he's also the director of the Intertribal Nursery Council. So I'm going to see if I can flip this over to him. As our first webinar, you have to be a little patient with us as we kind of work out the technical details of this, but let's see if I can transfer this over to him now.
Well, hello. Thank you for the introduction, Jane. I see all green lights on my end, so I'm assuming things are fine. I think I'll just put this out there. It appears that there's a little chat box that I can see, and so if there are problems from the participants you can't hear or something's up, maybe you can try the chat box and as a start, since we can't hear the participants. So, yep, I am Jeremiah Pinto. I hail from the southwest of the United States. I'm from the Bilagana clan, born for the Nakaidanet clan. My maternal grandfather is from the Wooden Shoe Windmill clan, and my paternal grandfather is from the Tohotlini clan. Good morning, everybody. So for those of you that caught that, I am Dinesh from New Mexico originally, and my father is Navajo, my mother is Dutch, and so for my mother's clans, I kind of have to make that up. The Dutch are known for their wooden shoes and windmills. So anyways, it's a pleasure to be here and be able to share some of my experiences with these two topics, which I think are very important in relation to producing native plants. And I'm just going to kind of get rolling here. And again, if you have any glitches or any issues, maybe you can try the chat box and we'll go from there. It is a little awkward giving a webinar because I do rely on feedback from folks when I give presentations, and sometimes I crack jokes or whatever, and I rely on that feedback to help me relax or do whatever. And anyways, I've got nothing here, so maybe you can laugh in the chat box if I do crack a joke. All right, let's see here. Forward, down. Okay. The first thing would be to okay, can you hear me? Let's see. I'm not being able to advance my slide. Let's try this. Okay, so objectives. One of the first objectives for this talk is to increase awareness on the use of native plants and natural resources in other fields. And then also, I want to illustrate the adaptability and compatibility of a Western science concept with relevant cultural knowledge, hence the title of the talk. I start with a couple questions, and this is where I rely on some feedback, but I'll just kind of roll through this. I have a question up here: what is traditional ecological knowledge? There's lots of ways to define this, but it's pretty much, I think, native science. It's our science. It's our original science of observation of the natural surroundings and what's going on a day-to-day and season-to-season basis, and etc. So why do we need native plants? I'll talk about this in terms of historical context and now, and then I'm going to ask, what is the target plant concept? This is something that's been cool to learn and explore, and something that's very near and dear to my heart, and in the way I frame how I propagate plants for different reasons, and even why I do research on plants for specific reasons as well. So hopefully at the end of all this, we'll be able to kind of pull all that stuff together. So it's just kind of, for the natives out there, this is just kind of, preaching to the choir. Native Americans have had a rich history and connection, a deep connection to native plants. I mean, without them, we wouldn't have been able to persist on the landscape for so long. They were our food shelter. They provided textiles, medicine, and helped us with our ceremonies. And over time, the knowledge gained from being able to use all these plants and different things helped us manage the land as well. There was burning going on. There was use of and propagation of certain plants even, and without these, as I mentioned, we wouldn't have been able to persist on the landscape. So there's definitely a historical connection here, and these days we have those connections still, but we also have a different kind of connection and a different need for native plants on indigenous lands. for those tribes that have lands to manage, there's all kinds of land management activities that are occurring on these lands. And so native plants are being propagated for reservations, on reservations for various stuff. There are tribes that have large forestry greenhouses here in the US, so they're growing trees to reforest their lands because they're harvesting their timber and milling their timber. Folks are doing restoration on their lands, and this includes cultural restoration, which I'll get to in a minute. There are tribal programs that manage wildlife, and so native plants are being grown for habitat. Bioengineering is some of the projects that I've seen going on, invasive species mitigation, and of course disturbance such as wildfire. Trees are being planted after wildfire, and and so on. So, there's a rich history that we have this connection, but now in this day and age, reservations have really contemporary needs in terms of they have natural resource departments, and they're addressing all these factors, and they're using native plants to address all these factors. And they are doing so with modern tools and concepts. I've been all over the US, and I've seen a lot of different tribal greenhouses, and um, they're all using various types of technology. I mean, there's some state-of-the-art greenhouses with really highly technical climate control systems and irrigation systems. And then there are greenhouses that are using very basic stuff. But anyways, this is I would say, quote, newer type technology to help us grow plants. Um, so, to face those contemporary management needs, we have new tools that we're using and new understanding of how to use these tools. And these are a couple pictures of some tribal greenhouses. In addition to just classifying contemporary needs for native plants and the tools that are being used, there's this additional need. As I mentioned, we have the historical connection to our cultural needs, and we still have those needs on our reservations and on our land. So there are tribes that have these greenhouses, these really modern, complicated greenhouses, or very simple greenhouses, and they're still addressing cultural needs and ties to plants in terms of cultural preservation, producing plants that they can't find as much anymore. They're educating the youth about plants and tribal plants. They're addressing the needs of availability, and all these other things. And so um, as opposed to another, like a public land agency or a private agency who has a greenhouse that's doing reforestation or restoration type stuff that is just focused on the land management. A lot of the tribal nurseries that I've interacted with over the years are doing that, and they're still doing a connection to their cultural needs. So that's kind of a cool framework, and this talk is just basically kind of marrying all the concepts of how different folks are doing this, using this Western science and tying it back to their culture, and then all in the context of the target plant concept. So, but in doing so, there are potential conflicts with traditional ideals. And this might seem pretty obvious to some, but is maybe not obvious to others. But when you are producing plants in a greenhouse, it's an artificial environment. And I learned this early on when I started working with the Intertribal Nursery Council. In fact, even when it was formed in 2001, and I started working in about 2002. But there were some real concerns with the idea of using native plants that had been propagated in a nursery for any kind of cultural elements, and that is I guess pretty plain to understand when you understand the context. So the woman here in the red shirt in the middle is Theodora. She's a wonderful woman. She's a medicine woman, and she was one of the ones that kind of hit everybody head on with the idea, saying, hey, look, if I use plants to heal my people, and these plants are coming from the greenhouse, it disconnects everything in the healing process, and disrupts the spirituality of what I'm trying to do. And so don't do it, basically, was kind of her lesson. Just, don't do it. It's not the right thing to do. So for someone who's who's an active live propagator of plants or who does that as their living, it might be a little tough to hear that, but it's also a valid and real concern. So yeah, don't do it. Okay. It's good to hear. The cool story about this is that we learned from each other over the years. Everybody did, from the other participants in the Intertribal Nursery Council, and we all kind of learned and got to a mutual understanding of like maybe why it is necessary to produce native plants. But anyways, there's some concerns, and also that's just from a spirituality and connected point of view, but also on a trophic point of view. If you're producing plants in a greenhouse, that's not really natural. Um, if whatever inputs you're putting into those plants might have lasting effects, and if folks are eating those plants or using them as medicine, or putting those plants in their mouth as they're processing them to make things, it could have an influence on the person themselves. And then there was also potential conflicts with genetics as well, and perhaps I'll get into that a little bit more later. But there's valid concerns. This is, yeah, and I can see this as well. But um, but as I kind of alluded to, it's just kind of an understanding we need to find a balance, because we do have some really degraded landscapes, and they are in need of repair. And growing plants for these landscapes is a really great tool to use. Um, so our goal is to use to understand the connections better, to understand and listen and facilitate the connections, so that we can do the best we can. And we have to we're still going to use our greenhouses, so we're going to use the latest technological tools, but we need to think about how to be more engaging in the traditional knowledge that we have and the desires from our community. And we do this by building trust and talking with one another. Okay, so Theodora continued to come to meetings, the Intertribal Nursery Council meetings, and was also kind of understanding and getting to this point, saying we had these conversations over a couple of years, and it was to the point where she said, I can't find the plants that I used to find for medicine in the same spots I used to find them anymore. They're not there. I find all kinds of other plants that I've never seen that I don't know. And so basically the idea was that these areas were being overtaken by invasive species, and so she's trying to heal the people, and the landscape isn't even healthy. And so we came to this understanding that, wow, we have to do something about the landscape. We have to heal the landscape before we can start to heal our people. And it was like light bulbs kind of went on for everybody. And she's, pretty soon she was wanting to propagate her own native plants just to get them back on the landscape. So that was pretty dang cool. So this is not an easy task, to find a balance. I threw this quote up there, which is from the Society of Ecological Restoration, who is works with indigenous peoples, and has holds knowledge from indigenous peoples as a science in itself. And what they say is a successful integration will require a thorough and thoughtful synthesis where concepts are considered within their cultural context and not as bits of knowledge or information to be inserted into the prevailing scientific framework. Um, and I understand that. I think it's also good to hear and see that and understand that, like, we have to protect that original knowledge, and and hold it sacred and consider it as the original science. But we also kind of have to use the tools. We already have greenhouses, we already use cars, we already have refrigerators, we already have all this modern stuff, and we have to kind of, it's unfortunate, but we are having to figure out ways to integrate culture and still use all these and exist in this modern world. So it's not an easy task, and we sometimes have to use the best tools we can. But I put this up there because this is exactly what I'm going to do. The opposite of this, or what that says not to do. So again, just trying to use the best tools to accomplish a goal that works for everybody. Being a Forest Service employee, it's I think there's a history of using a cookie cutter approach to tribes and tribal nations across the U.S., and we know that doesn't work. um, each tribe is unique and different in its own way, as are individuals. And so when we consider putting together a roadmap, we have to realize that when we're producing plants for land management, and for restoration or reforestation, that we can't always use a cookie cutter approach, but that we need to be adaptable. So when we talk about target plants, native plant use, and how they function and work on the landscape, we still kind of have to have a roadmap that makes sure that we're dotting all our I's and crossing all our T's, so to speak, but we make it more of like a cloud, so that we can see everything that's in there, but then we put the pieces together how they fit the best for us. So we have to create a space where we have our own creativity, adaptability, expansion, and inclusion, but we're not forgetting certain elements along the way. So I have this cloud here with a plant in the middle. This is the plant that we want for our particular objectives, and we have all the direct factors that make that plant what it is, but then we have all these indirect factors that really are that creativity space that we're using. So, okay, cool. So I'm just kind of framing things up a little bit, working towards the target plant concept, which I'll get to in a couple slides. I want to talk about how, from just the Western science approach, there were a lot of traditional models set up in terms of accomplishing land management using native plants. And a lot of these traditional models were built on like Forest Service. I guess I'm referring to old Forest Service models in the response to all the wildfires in the early 1900s. You know, these vast wildfires, I think even from my area, I'm in Moscow, Idaho, they had these 1910 fires that burned lots of land. And they set up nurseries to plant trees so that they could repair, reforest the landscape. So they set up these traditional models where, you know, fires came through, so they have a need for seedlings. So they built these nurseries up on site, and then the seedlings were planted, and a lot of them would die, but they were doing their best. They were growing seedlings as best they could, and they were planting them, and a lot were surviving, but like also a lot were dying. But they had this kind of a linear approach to this traditional model of how to do things, and it can be switched around to a couple different things. This other thing is, okay, we set up a nursery somewhere, we grow seedlings, then something happens, then we use those seedlings and the seedlings are planted, and then still we get a lot of mortality, and we don't really, we still feel satisfied in that we're working towards an end goal. And this was the standard for quite a long time. And this is also kind of the approach that maybe even we use today as like maybe home landscapers or home gardeners. Well, at least if you're like me, which is like one weekend you decide you're going to take on a project. And so all of a sudden I have an immediate need for seedlings. I go to Home Depot, I go to Walmart, I buy my seedlings, I put them in the ground at home, I water them in, I fertilize them or do whatever, and I hope they survive. But I always know that there's a nursery there that has seedlings that I can just use and put in the ground. That there's a big difference when you're doing that kind of management and you're thinking about native plant use for land management these days. And that is that for my situation, I have a lot of post-planting care that I can do to make sure my seedlings live and survive. But in terms of the native plant stuff that we're doing, those don't get a lot of post-planting care because that's really expensive. So we want to be able to put seedlings on the landscape and have a whole bunch of them survive, or as many as we can survive on their own. So anyways, we have these linear models and seedlings are dying, but we're still kind of satisfied maybe that we're just working towards an end goal. Over the years, folks started to say, hey, look, we need to actually kind of make a new model that gives us feedback and allows us to take a little more of a scientific approach to how we do things. I mean, um, I think the essential thing here was that new model is more of a circular feedback loop where everything is connected. So you have a need for seedlings, and when you have a need for seedlings, you can think, okay, I need something. What does that seedling look like? How is it going to function? You define what that target plant is going to look like and do. Now you go to your nursery, you have your nursery grow your seedlings for that specific purpose that you're looking for. And this bottom box says establish outplanting trials, where you establish trials or you just put them in the ground, but you evaluate how those plants do, and then you think about how much mortality you had or how much success you had, and you think about, okay, and the next time I do this, I get to improve upon this process. So it's a feedback loop and it's connected. And I think this is kind of, this is kind of a natural human thing to do, going from a linear approach to a circular approach, understanding how everything is connected and trying to make things better overall. Traditional knowledge is kind of based on this feedback process. So kind of funny how like a Western approach to reforestation restoration is kind of goes towards a circular approach, feedback approach that is more successful in the long run. So that works us towards the target plant concept. So hold on a second. The target plant concept was originally developed by foresters, but again, I think the concept relies on this idea of observation and thinking about all the moving parts in the process, and it gives us a holistic approach to native plant restoration. So this graphic is really kind of complicated. It's not really a circle, but it is a circle in a sense, but it breaks things up into steps. So at the top of the graphic, we have three important projects or three important uh, approaches that help guide the process of identifying what target plants are. One of the aspects is that the nursery that grows the plants, and then the person who wants and uses the plants and is putting them on the landscape, so the nursery client partnership, that needs to exist. And if it can be a good one, that's good to have. You need to be able to work with your nurseries to help get the plant materials that you need. One of the second aspects is outplanting site. You need to have a good understanding of what's going on at your planting site, and I'll go into this a little bit further later. And then also too, quality is probably as the most important thing. If you don't have quality seedlings going into the ground, you're doomed from the start. So, and for native plants, we kind of think about, when we go to Walmart, Home Depot, buy those garden plants, we look for the ones that have the biggest, brightest flowers. They look really green. They have all these nice aspects that they've been bred for to be nice in our yards or our gardens or whatever. But for native plants, we need to consider other aspects that you might not just see from a superficial level. And that's where you have to work with your nursery to understand what the quality aspects are before those plants go into the ground. Okay, so the target plant concept has, here we have 8 questions that we use to help us get to our target plant and get it in the ground. And there are lots of iterations of this concept where you have 8 questions. Sometimes there's 6, sometimes there's 5. That kind of changes. They do basically all kind of cover the same things, but this is some people are lumpers, some people are splitters. So this is an 8-step process, which I'll go through after this slide in more detail. But this is kind of like your checkbox. You've already thought, okay, I need to have a plant that's going for this objective. Now, how do I get to propagating that plant and making it look and form the way it's supposed to on the landscape? So yeah, so this is the process, and I'll define this a little bit more here. Oh, but before I go and do that, this is kind of where I go against that quote that I had at the beginning. I think of this as they have this concept that works. It really makes us helps us consider all the steps in working towards a successful native plant project. And I just look as each one of these steps is an opportunistic time for us to give some serious indigenous inputs into how we form our target plant. So, you have your concept attributes here on the left, and then you have a lot of good opportunities to be working with tribal members to give this some traditional knowledge, some historical perspective, and some function that the tribe wants. So I'll just kind of go through. We have objectives. So first part of the target plan concept is you have to have an objective. So that's pretty obvious. And so I just list a couple of objectives here that I've seen working with tribes in different places and whatnot. And so target plants can come in a variety of shapes and sizes. from an actual seedling that has leaves and roots and etc. to a seed. A seed can be a target plant if that's what you decide is the best approach, is distributing seeds upon the landscape, to using other types of plant materials. Like this is a graphic of stream bank restoration where willow cuttings are being used for some bioengineering. This is up in Montana with I believe up near on the Flathead Reservation. But these willow whips are being used in a bioengineering sense, but they will also too root themselves and will stabilize the stream bank, but will also grow. So project types can be very interesting and very integrated. So this is restoration of bird habitat up in Hawaii. And this is like an area where there's 150 years of grazing mismanagement, and these used to be really lush forests that were inhabited by native birds in Hawaii, which are now endangered. Um, these native forests were really diverse areas, and they were used by the native peoples a long time ago. And not only did they use the plant products from this area, but they also used the bird species that inhabited these forests as well. So project objectives could be including, really tackling these really drastically disturbed sites and making them more culturally appropriate and usable again. So that's just another example. Objectives could be also something like this. The Seneca Nation has adopted a native plant policy where all of their new buildings that are supposed to get landscaping, their policy is that they cannot use any non-native plants. So this guy, Ken Parker, a colleague of mine, set up the system where they've included landscaping that has supplied plants that are used, traditional plants that were food, medicine, fiber, dyes, or ceremonial plants. And he himself is a green thumb, and he also has a horticulture background, but has created a situation where the landscape looks nice. It matches a really contemporary, nice building, but those plants are not just plants from Walmart or Home Depot. They're actually functional plants that the tribe used over time, and it makes it look nice too. So that's a cool objective. So within formulating your objective for just the land management and what you're trying to do, whether you're trying to restore a stream bank, rebuild a forest, reforest, or whatnot, anytime in those objective formulations, anytime you can involve elders is a great time to incorporate traditional knowledge. A lot of elders, if you're looking at restoring a particular area, maybe they use that area at some point in time and they say, hey, look, we used to have these plants and that plants and these plants and those plants in there. I remember I used to go there as a kid and we used to collect this and that. And then, even the stories would go on to say, yeah, those plants were really great because the fiber was really good in those plants. I remember that. And it'd be really cool to see that again. And it would really, another example might be, it would be really cool to restore this area because it's closer to where I live now, as opposed to me having to go, 100 miles to collect my plants. And so it's just a really great time if you have the relationship and the time to be able to extract some of that knowledge and understand how you can make it a positive thing. So getting the community involved during your objective formulation that's probably the number one place to be able to use that knowledge to kind of work towards the restoration that you're doing. Site evaluation. So this is kind of a critical aspect in those 8 steps that I think it may not so much have to do with traditional knowledge, because what you're looking at in terms of a site evaluation is you're looking at an area. So let's consider restoration. You're looking at an area that doesn't represent any historical context at all. And you're thinking about putting native plants in this highly disturbed site. So this is the sense where you're going to a site and you have to know what you're trying to do, your objectives, and you have to do some research. Maybe there's research that helps you understand how to establish plants in a burned area or a mined area or some other kind of situation. And you have to think about, okay, within this site, what are all the things that help a plant grow? What are all the things that want to kill a plant? And how can I address these factors so that when I put plants in here, they're ultimately going to do the job I want them to do? So Limiting factors on the outplanting site can include all kinds of stuff. I have, a whole list of things here. Vegetation. I even have some things that are indirect, like cost can be something that is a limiting factor. Um, Organization, capacity, people. It's just really interesting. I think this is all the stuff that wants to help you not do the job you want to do on this outplanting site. But primarily from a plant perspective, we're looking at that graphic on the right where we have atmospheric um, items that are trying to kill or that we need to make our plant happy with, and also the edaphic environment as well. When you start to look at all the things that want to kill your plant, so to speak, there's typically more than one. And of course, the effect is sequential and cumulative, and it might be overwhelming when you come to think of it, because after all, you are on this site to do restoration. There's a reason why you need to be there. So the main idea is you need to prioritize and only tackle some of the main ones. And one of the main ones is primarily soil moisture. So you want to make sure that when you put your plants in the ground that there's adequate soil moisture. I think this is probably one of the number one aspects of trying to address those limiting factors on the outplanting site. Another one I have listed as an example is mycorrhizal fungi. This graphic basically kind of shows that the more disturbance you have in terms of disturbed soil or soil removal on a site, the more you're disrupting the soil biota. And so maybe this is something that you need to think about and tackle in terms of trying to boost the capacity of your plants to live. There are other limiting factors. Of course, vegetation is also one. Vegetation is competing for light, nutrients, and water. You might have temperatures, extreme hot temperatures or cold temperatures that want to kill your plants. Animals could kill your plants. I mean, as soon as you plant your plants, like here you put this very nitrogen rich, this very nutrient rich plant on the landscape. That's a great source of food for animals. And sometimes as soon as you put them in the ground and turn your back, they come and try and eat them. And especially this guy here, this is one that really wants to eat your seedlings out. So limiting factors, people and animals. This is some project that I did in Haiti. They have it's a very poor country, and folks rely on their animals and they rely on the landscape for stuff to help them keep them alive, essentially, and to also help them make a little bit of money to get by on a day-to-day basis. But I mean, how do you address the factor if you put plants in the ground that folks want their animals to be fed so that they can keep their animals alive, or maybe they would need to make charcoal and stuff out of the plants. So as soon as a tree becomes merchantable, it's cut down. So I mean, humans themselves, we can be limiting in our own sense. But in terms of evaluation of sites and limiting factors, it's great to get all the perspectives of your community and consider trophic levels and land ownership and cultural sites, and being able to understand what might be preventing you from doing your job, and just working through those in a stepwise process as best you can, and then also mitigating those processes as best you can. So in terms of site preparation, you might have to remove some vegetation, you might have to do some soil rebuilding, you might have to use some of the other aspects of the TPC, the target plant concept, to help boost your plant survivorship on the site. So soil moisture, I mentioned earlier, was one of the things that you really need to mitigate. This can be done in like, I guess, two major ways: mechanical and an herbicide thing. And so this goes into that whole consideration of who's going to be using the plants and why. Um, we've shown through research that if you mechanically remove vegetation, you can increase soil moisture and your plants will be happier. And that takes a lot of work, but in that sense, you're not using any chemicals. And so any folks that might be using those plants later on down the line, that will be a benefit. In some situations where you may not have that, folks might use herbicides, and herbicides is also, it's basically the same thing, but it's using a chemical formulation. And it works to help increase soil moisture. But you need to understand who's going to be using those sites, and why and what and when and where, and address those concerns up front and ahead of time. So lots of consultation and education and trials and demonstrations. And again, really, I guess it really all comes down to communication. So engaging, and folks like to know that they're being helpful and helping you accomplish your restoration goals, but they also feel good about giving you input and seeing it happen so that they can use the sites or use plants later on and feel good about it, not be worried about it. So genetic consideration is another part of the target plant concept that we think about. There's a lot of science in terms of forestry where in the forestry concept, all the trees that are being put out on the landscape, they all have these what are called seed zones, meaning there's lots of science that tells you how far you can move seed from a latitudinal gradient, even a longitudinal gradient, and even an elevational gradient. You know, ponderosa pine, for example, is a tree that's widely distributed all over the West, and um, there are some different subspecies, but you know, you can't take ponderosa pine seed from British Columbia, Canada, and grow that pine seed down in New Mexico, where there is also ponderosa pine. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. The studies have already been done. Doesn't work. It goes without saying that any of the species that you're growing and using, they don't have seed zones because the science hasn't been done yet, but it makes sense that you don't maybe want to be moving things too far out of their natural zones. So when you don't have some of these guidelines, it's best to kind of just consider, hey, I should, if I have a project over here on this part of the reservation, I should identify plant populations that are fairly close and in similar habitat that I can use, so that I can ensure that they're locally adapted and they're going to grow the best. So those are the genetic considerations from a more scientific standpoint, so to speak, but also too is a good opportunity to make other genetic considerations for desirable plant attributes in a cultural aspect. And this has been done for a long time already prior to any of the science. Plants were being selected for and used for a whole suite of reasons, and it goes without saying, you know, I mean, not only for medicine, but you know, for basket weaving and aromatics and taste and whatnot. And so it's a good chance to engage elders and community members to find out what they think is the best. This picture is some folks in California harvesting roots for basket weaving, and they've been working with the tribe locally to find good populations of these grasses that had the right attributes for some of the best basket weaving materials. So now you've kind of gone through all these hoops to kind of figure out what it is you're doing, why, using the genetics, the appropriate genetics. Now the nursery can grow your seedlings. You got the seeds. Now you can use a variety of techniques to grow plants of all kinds of different sizes, shapes, and ages. And this is where that nursery client relationship really works. Like you can help your nursery grow plants with maybe longer root systems so that they can access soil moisture deeper in the soil profile. Maybe you need a tall seedling because you want the seedling to be above that competing vegetation for light. All kinds of different things that you can do here in terms of growing different types of target plants. So in terms of the stock type of choice, really, like, and this cost is a factor here too. The larger the seedling you grow, the more expensive it is. That's pretty obvious, but you can work on this and find a balance. But let's say you have a site that's maybe not highly disturbed, but you want to see some services out of this site right away, whether it's you know, clean water or just habitat or whatever. But you can also say, well, okay, cool. Maybe we want bigger plants so they can establish and flower, so that the flowers can be used for such and such. And so we want to really cater towards the harvesting of these plants. And so you create your target plant based on that as a significant factor. So timing of the outplanting window. This is not so much a nursery thing. I guess it could be a nursery thing because your nursery they're done growing the plants and now they need to go out on the landscape. And you kind of need to pay attention to a lot of things here. I guess for us here in the West, the mountainous West, the outplanting window is a time when the plants have their optimal potential to grow. You have to have access to your site, and also you have to have adequate soil moisture. And you know, we've gone through all this complicated stuff to find out what an outplanting window might look like for certain species. But we talk about plant dormancy and stress resistance, and times of year when the soil is frozen and whatnot, and it gets pretty complicated. And we've even paid attention to some of the phenological stages and how plants grow. But I mean, really, what it comes down to is just paying attention to when the landscape has those ideal conditions. Maybe the frost season is past finally, or maybe the rains are coming and they're going to be here on such and such a time. And we can talk to elders and find out when some of those historical times are, or like when certain things happen. I use Hawaii as an example a lot, but there was one example where when these trees started flowering in some of the dry areas of Hawaii, that meant a certain season of fish was coming on. So, it might be the same type of thing. It's like, okay, when you start to see um, the service berries up here in Idaho, they start to bloom. You're starting to work your way towards the dry season, and soil moisture is going to be depleting. So, um, using the right tools to plant your target plants, all that effort that you've gone through is important. This might seem like a no-brainer, right? Just take a shovel, dig a hole, put your plant in there and walk away. Not quite. There's all still at this phase, there's all kinds of things that can go wrong. And if you don't use the right tools or techniques, this is like a little death wish for your plant, right? Right after all that hard work and before the plant even gets a chance to grow and do its own thing. Um, using the right kind of tool and planting correctly is important. So we have like an illustration up here in the upper left-hand corner where there's a boot stepping on this uh, we call it a dibble planter, and they're really handy, these dibble planters, where you can just have this dibble that's the same size as the root system of your plants, and you just punch a hole in the ground, and your plant fits in there just perfectly, and then you just put a little soil over the top and it looks great, right? Well, that can work for a lot of plants in certain soil types, but in certain situations you might be in a really heavy clay soil, and you might have a plant that doesn't grow roots very well in heavy clay soils, and when you stomp that thing into the ground, you compact that soils around where the roots go, and then the plant can't grow its roots into the surrounding area. And so, it's something to consider. Or, folks talk about using their foot to tamp the soil in around their plant. And some plants are a little more sensitive to others. And some folks consider that the death stomp. You're tamping in that soil with your foot, and really you're kind of crushing the plant's root system. So you kind of got to be aware of some of these things. Um, we have like all kinds of hand tools. There's all kinds of modern tools and technology that you can use. Um, but yeah, even really fancy, expensive ones that are pretty innovative in terms of planting riparian species in like really rocky areas and whatnot. But planting tools have been used for a long time, and even today, where you may have your favorite planting shovel a long time ago, certain folks had their favorite digging sticks and their favorite planting bars and whatnot, and using those tools adapted over time to be just right for those situations. And so it just goes to show that yes, we need to consider the right tools for the right job. So kind of trying to wrap maybe up some of the target plant concept stuff and the traditional knowledge. This is a really cool article that was published in the Native Plants Journal in 2003. But this was a cool project where I kind of felt like that all these things kind of came together nicely. It was a ceremonial planting that was done on the island of Maui, and essentially there was this highly degraded area that needed some restoration. It was a cultural area. It was one that gathering took place, went all the way down to the ocean, and so that whole area was used from sea to the forest and whatnot. And anyways, it had been degraded over the years, and so the local agencies wanted to do some restoration in this area, and they basically engaged the community, engaged the elders to make this project happen. So what plants were there? Um, what plants would you like to see there? This is what can be grown, and this is what we should do. So the nurseries were growing these plants and engaging the community along the entire way. And then before the plants were getting put out onto the landscape, they gave a blessing to the plants and had a nice ceremony. And it was really kind of serendipitous, I guess, the way this all happened, because they gave the plants a blessing. They had these ceremonies and put the plants in the ground. And this is an area that is known to be dry. But after that, it was kind of cool because some moisture came in and really helped boost those plants and get them established, and help this project work towards its success. So it was an incorporation of using this approach of engaging the community, listening and understanding what was there, working towards that goal using greenhouses and whatnot, and then giving the plants both a spiritual and cultural lift to get them going. So it's a really cool story. So target plants for success. There's all kinds of opportunities to use the science and use traditional knowledge and finding a way that works. And in doing so, we have to use this feedback approach, and we have to shift from what is available to what do we need, what can we identify that we need ahead of time to succeed. And then also realizing that within this concept or whatever, that everything is interdependent. If one thing changes, everything must be reevaluated. And I kind of finished with that because that's like one of the most elemental cultural things that we have. So this target plant concept is really, I think, just based on some serious cultural ideals, which is that everything is interdependent. So with that, I'll finish. This is supposed to be a joke. Perfect target plants for highly disturbed sites. These are some photographs that were taken by me and by a colleague. This is like a gravel landscape bit that I think this is in California. Somebody just planted some plastic pine because there's nothing else that's going to grow there. And then this is a pub somewhere where they have these shrubs growing in cement in the pots, these plastic shrubs that will never die, of course. So anyways, laugh, haha. Okay. And with that, I'm going to conclude. Looks like I'm right next to 45 minutes. If you have any questions or want to chat any more about any one of these, I can go at length on target plant concept, or I can share a lot of the experiences I've had in working with tribes and engaging all these different factors and whatnot. I'd be happy to chat with you about that. So I think with that, I think I'm done for this, and I can maybe entertain a question or something via chat, or I'm going to turn this over to Jane and see what happens next. Jane, are you there?
Yeah, I am here, and that was a great presentation, and thank you so much. That was terrific. So there was a couple questions that were typed in, and I don't know if you can see those, Jeremy.
Oh, I didn't actually. Let me see.
No, it's okay. I mean, it was you had a flow going, and it was great. So, but there's a couple questions there.
I can't see them.
Okay, so I could unmute this person. Hang on just one second here, and she can ask these herself. Let's see if we can get this going. Give me 1 second. And if anybody else has any questions, if you want to type them in, or I can unmute you, or you can type in. Let's see. There, Ashley, are you there?
Hi, Jeremy. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Hi, Ashley.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was wonderful. I'm having a hard time pulling up my window again, but my questions that I had for you were, you were talking about those seed zones a couple of slides back, and I was just wondering, I've heard of these, I've seen maps of them like in labs and stuff like that, but I was just wondering if you know how extensive the literature is available for outside like the lower 48. Like, are these seed zones, based off of science and its colonial nature in the past and present? Like, are they limited to the United States? What about like territories, quote unquote, under the US? And, if you know about that, like, and how, I just wonder how these seed maps, I guess, or seed zones that you're talking about, how they were originally created. That was my first question. And the second one was more about, are there programs for students out there that talk more about these holistic ways of viewing, like restoration, reforestation with a cultural lens that you've been teaching us today for like high schoolers or undergrads? Those are the two questions I had.
Yeah, those are great questions. So regarding the seed zone stuff, I think there is a lot of the literature is lower 48 centric in terms of that. That's I mean, primarily when there's a lot of logging going on back in the logging days. I mean, we still cut, but folks were, when they would log an area, there's a realization that if you didn't plant trees there, you wouldn't have a future product or future ecosystem services for those areas. And so the science developed on like how far can we move seed zones, and because those products were really highly commercialized, they were really developed here in the U.S. And so I think there are other places around the world and even in territories that those have developed, and I'd have to kind of search those a little more extensively. And I would have to say that primarily if you do start looking for those kinds of aspects, you'll find that most of the seed zone development is all centered around plants, native plants that have commercial value, unfortunately. But that makes sense, right? Because they're looking for future products and the sustainability of the future products. However, in terms of restoration, we're looking at value in terms of ecosystem services or cultural services for these plants. And it would take a large amount of money to study all the different plants and how far you can move each one of the different plants. But fortunately, there is like just some basic literature out there that gives you some pretty basic guidelines on collection, like how far away you might want to go, how many different types of plants you want to collect from. And if you want, you can send me an email and I can send you a link to that article. I can send you that article. And basically, I do have colleagues that are working on some of the science for some restoration plants in terms of new seed zones and whatnot. But again, so this is Western centric, Great Basin specifically, and it's where the money is for those plants. But I mean, the idea is that local is always best, and as close, if you can't get local, as close to local is good as well. So did that answer that question for you?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, and second question regarding the teaching of the integration of these two things. I'm pretty sure this is happening at the undergraduate level. I mean, I know here in Moscow, Idaho, at the University of Idaho, I actually used to teach a class that was about indigenous knowledge and native plants based on the type of stuff that I covered today. I used to co-teach a class there, but I know it's still being taught there and the curriculum changes. In terms of undergrad, I'd like to think that something like this is being, or not undergrad, high school students, I'd like to think it's being done, but unfortunately I don't have my fingers on the pulse there. But I would have to imagine that in some schools, not all, that there's a good integration of this. Might not be plant centric, but I would like to think there's something. I would like to see more of it, because when I'm working with these students, and we're talking about these things, it's basically I'm trying to empower the students and saying, hey, like, you're the next land managers. You're the ones, like, I'm teaching this from a conceptual aspect. You're going to be the implementers. So you have to figure out how to take these concepts, these ideals, these approaches, and you're going to have to figure out how to make it work. And then tell me how it works, so that if I'm teaching it, then I can teach it better. So it's a feedback process, right? So, but yeah, I think I also know that there's a whole, here at the U of I, there's also a whole program, I think, within the Native Studies program where, or within the education program, where there's this whole pedagogy of learning and incorporating cultural learning, and it's like learning styles, cultural knowledge, place-based learning. There's academics that are teaching this at the university level. A couple of them are my
Awesome.
friends.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, they're pretty interesting. Yeah, cool. Thanks for your questions.
Okay, any other questions? I didn't see any more being typed in. So I think that will wrap things up. Again, thank you so much for that, Jeremy, and thank you for everybody who tuned in. This has been recorded, and we will be posting a link to it on our website, which is tapconnection.org. I think I can also email out the link to the recording as well for the attendees, and so you'll have that and can share it. If you would like to tune in for future webinars that we'll be doing, or sign up for our conferences or workshops or whatever, if you go again to our website, tapconnection.org, and sign up for our mailing list, we can keep you notified on that. So thank you, and till next time, thank you. Okay,
Thank
bye-bye.
you so much. Signing off.
Signing
Have a
off.
good day.
Okay, bye-bye.